We're going to show you how to cut bias strips for a bias quilt binding. Bias binding is more flexible than traditional on-grain binding. If your quilt is finished with a curved edge, or if you don't want mitered corners, then the bias binding will ease around each curve. It also gives beautiful visual effects if you're using strips, checks, or plaids. First, we need to know how much binding to make. This will require a little bit of math, but then the most complicated step is over. We will be cutting a 2-inch wide piece of binding that will make a 1/4 inch wide finished binding. So how much fabric do you need to start with? Measure all sides of your quilt and add 6 to 10 inches to this total. Now comes the math. You're going to multiply the total you just calculated by 2, then calculate the square root of that number. Most basic calculators have a square root function button. Each side of your piece of fabric will be that final number. Confused yet? As an example, let's pretend that your total is 300 inches. Multiply your total by 2 inches. This comes to 600, which is the total area of fabric that you need. Calculate the square root of 600, which is 25. So, you need a piece of fabric that is 25 inches wide and 25 inches long, or 25 inches square, to cut enough binding for your project. Now that we've got the right amount, we need to prepare the fabric. It is important that your piece of fabric be on the grain before beginning. Often, a piece of fabric gets off grain from folding and refolding before you actually use it. Fold the fabric in half lengthwise, selvage to selvage, and align so selvages meet and the fold is smooth. The cut ends do not have to match, and probably won't. Trim off both selvages with one cut. Using your ruler, cut one end of the remaining edge. Make this cut at 90 degrees. Press your fabric to remove any folds and creases. Now, fold the corner of the fabric down at a 45-degree angle until it meets the bottom edge of the fabric piece. Smooth the fold into place. Now we're ready to cut our binding. Using your ruler and cutter, cut on the fold line. The place where you have cut is now the exposed bias. Once you have exposed bias, be extra careful not to tug or stretch your fabric because bias is very susceptible to stretching. Move the small triangle of fabric to the opposite side of the larger piece. Now lay the triangle into the sewing position. This is the shape of the piece that you'll want to see after you've moved the cut triangle. Keeping right sides together, sew the vertical edges together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open your fabric and press the seam open, again being very careful not to stretch the piece out of shape. Using your ruler and rotary cutter, cut 2-inch wide bias strips from your piece. Keep cutting until you have enough strips to make a continuous piece long enough for your quilt. Now you can sew your strips together and attach them to your quilt. If you'd like advice on how to sew your strips into a binding, or on how to attach the binding to the quilt, watch Connecting Threads beginning binding video. Here at Connecting Threads, we are making quilting affordable again. At only $5.96 per yard, you'll find our exclusive fabrics collections only on our website or in our catalog. Visit us at www.connectingthreads.com to find a huge supply of quilting books, tools, and batting, plus our exclusive high-quality thread and quilting fabric collections.